Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Office Hours. I'm your host, as usual, Stuart Newsom, and I'm thrilled to kick off the first session of a series of many that we hope to have on RAC audits. This series is really going to be designed to equip you with the knowledge and tools to confidently handle RAC audits. I'm sure everyone's been through them. If you haven't, then you probably will. I've always said that it's not a matter of if, but when. The RAC audits are part of the RCM process. So we're going to take you through everything from the moment you receive an audit letter to submitting the necessary documentation and avoiding some of the common pitfalls, specifically recoupments of payments. Now, to join me today, we have Julie Graham, who is our Senior Coding Manager at our RCM line of business here at Infinix. It's commonly known to us here internally as ERS, or Enhanced Revenue Services. We originally also had Christine Coronado, our Chief Operating Officer of ERS, was going to join us today, but she had another session or meeting that she had to attend to that was very important. So basically, just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover today, we're going to focus mainly on the audit letter. So it's all going to be about the audit letter. So I told you this was going to be a series. There's a lot of content that goes into RAC audits. So we're going to break it up into specific parts. So just be aware that I want to look out for some future office hours invites regarding this particular topic. And regarding the audit letter, we're actually going to be covering different types of audits that physicians may face. You know, I've always looked at this, that there are different types of audits. There's internal audits as well as peer-to-peer audits, but we're talking about different entities that may post audits for you. So it's not just about RAC. There's also TPE, post-reimbursement reviews, and then special investigation units. That sounds very official and ominous, so to speak. But by the end of the session, you'll have a clear understanding of how to approach RAC audits with a lot of confidence and be able to take those proactive measures that you can take to be prepared. And Julie is part of a team that has a lot of experience with this. Part of one of the services that we provide our clients is to assist them throughout the RAC audit process, from the moment they receive that letter all the way to the end when the deed is done. We have been there side by side, hand in hand, helping them with this. So there's a lot of experience that you're going to be leveraging today. Now, as always, I want to encourage everyone to participate by submitting your questions via the Q&A feature down below, and we'll address as many of those questions as possibly can towards the end of the session. Perhaps you have an experience with a RAC audit, you want to add some insight. It's not just Q&A. Maybe you just want to make a comment. Please feel free to do so. Share your knowledge, or if you had any issues with the RAC audit, feel free to ask a question as well. So, hey, Julie, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing today, Stuart?
Doing great, doing great.
All
Great,
right, good.
great to have you back. I know that
Thank you.
you've been with us before and had some excellent
Yes.
sessions before. And I know you're very excited about this particular subject just as well as I am. So I
Yeah,
just want to
a lot of
dive
great
right in.
information to
Yeah,
share.
yeah, awesome, awesome. So I just want to dive right in. So let's start by discussing the different types of audit letters that practice
Sure.
might receive. Just want to see if you could walk us through some of those key differences between these
Yeah.
types of audits.
So there's quite a few different audits. There's the TPE, which is the Target, Probe, and Educate. There are payer post-payment review audits, RAC audits, payer special investigation unit audits, um, supplemental medical review contractor audits, um, special investigation unit audit, which is a UPIC, and third-party contractors for commercial payers. Now there's each of these have a different purpose, and the audits target different things. So your TPE audit, the Target, Probe, and Educate program, is designed to help providers and suppliers reduce claims and appeals through one-on-one help. The goal is to quickly help you improve. The MAX will work with you in person to identify errors and help correct you. A payer post-payment review is a audit known as a post-audit a post-bill audit. It's a systematic process employed by health insurance payers to monitor the billing, coding, and documentation practices of healthcare providers. Um, then we have our RAC audits, which is the Recovery Audit Contractor Audit. And it's a systemic review of healthcare claims to identify and correct improper payments. The goal of a RAC audit is to ensure that all parties involved in a healthcare transaction are compensated fairly and accurately. The
Yeah, I like the way they put
SMRs,
that. Yeah, fairly and
I'm
accurate.
sorry.
I like the way they put that, fairly and accurately.
Yes, yes. And then there's the SMRC, which is the Supplemental Medical Review Contractor Audit, which conducts a nationwide medical review of Medicaid, Medicare Part A and B, and the DME POS claims to determine whether claim follows coverage, coding, payment, and billing requirements. So you may see those with like knee braces, for instance, with your ortho clients. An SMRC audit is like a RAC audit, with one key difference being that the SMRC audits are handled by one national contractor than regionally, like our RACs are handled. The Special Investigation Unit, or SIU audit, is an investigation conducted by an insurance company's SIU to review claims for potential fraud, waste, or abuse. The SIUs are responsible for protecting the insurance company's interest by conducting thorough investigations. And then lastly, we have our UPIC, the Unified Program Integrity Contractor Audit. This is an investigation into suspected fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid programs. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services commissions UPICs to conduct these audits to ensure that federal funds are used appropriately and that billed services are medically necessary.
Wow, that's a lot of
It
different
is a lot to remember too.
audit. Yeah, so that's the again, RAC audits are probably the most popular. People just
Yes,
understand that, and not just for Medicare, but there are commercial payers that will also want to conduct audits. But the whole point is to recoup payments. I guess that's the whole premise of some of the others. But they also could carry some criminal penalties as well
absolutely.
if there's any evidence of fraud and abuse that's there. And sometimes it doesn't take much, for that evidence to surface. So it's just, to me, that can be overwhelming. And it's like, okay,
Yeah,
there's a lot of risk. They can come at you different ways, different twists and turns on how these audits can originate. It's not just one type of audit, all these different types. To me, it
right.
look like they're really designed to come at different angles. And
Mm-hmm.
so to mitigate that risk, I know it's there's kind of like this fear factor there that when a practice receives an audit letter, so you've got the audit letter, and then you're like, "Wow, what's going to happen now? What do I do
Yeah,
next?"
yeah,
The first thing is probably panic, and people tend to react, to
yeah,
maybe in the wrong way, which we'll get to a little later. But um, so what are some of the immediate steps, that a practice should take upon receiving an audit letter, such as
yeah,
that you just described? Yeah,
yeah.
how can they mitigate risk from the outset?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So, first and foremost, the most important step is to assess the situation, by identifying the requester. So, who is it from? That will help you understand the type of audit. And then you want to evaluate the reason for the request, like what is the requester looking for? Are they looking for, medical necessity, coding, or a combination of issues? Is it a target and probe? So identifying the type of audit initially is your first step. Second, you want to identify the time limit, the due date for submission of requested documentation. For example, in our post-payment review audit by Max, SMRC, and RAC, you have 45 calendar days to submit that information. For a post-payment review by UPICS, you have 30 calendar days. So that's a difference. That's something
That's a
you
big
really need to
difference.
be aware of.
Mhm.
Those 15 days can matter a lot. If you're not familiar with UPIC, You may assume that you have 45 days, or if you're just not familiar with either of these, you may not, you may not know how long you have. So it's always important to identify the time limit that the letter lets you know, because the letter will tell you everything that they want and when they expect to receive the information by.
Mhm.
So, within this step, it's important to that all responses be submitted by the due date listed on the requested letter. However, if a practice cannot meet the deadline, it is crucial to contact the requester and ask for an extension. Also explaining the circumstances behind as to why you need the extension. If a response is not received by the due date, the requester has the authority to deny the claim, resulting in recoupment. And this process is often resource intensive, requiring
Mhm.
significant effort to make the insurance company repay the claim. Additionally, there is a cost to the practice due to the extra work involved, which can sometimes result in a negative outcome. So we want to make sure that we respond in a timely manner. And if you can't, make sure you request that extension. Third step would be to assemble a response team or an individual that will typically apply that will typically apply to smaller practices to handle the audit. And it is crucial that the assembled team or individual meets the following qualifications. These individuals should understand the audit process and steps. They should have knowledge of payer policies, knowledge of medical coding. So this may require obviously bringing in a medical coder specials or specialty, or coders with a certain specially coding expertise, clinical data and clinical data integration, and knowledge on insurance reimbursement.
Right. So it really matters the type of audit,
Yes.
particularly with the dates that you mentioned. I think everyone just kind of says an audit is an audit is an audit. It kind of has the same requirements, but that's another curveball, that's built in there that you really need to be aware. What type of audit this is, and then your steps also matter. Who is auditing me? So you'll understand where to pull those
Yes.
policies and what are they auditing. Many times,
Yes.
especially with a targeted probe and educate, the TPE that you mentioned, there's a reason it's targeted. So they're focusing on, some utilization of codes that may have been either overused, like you had said, lack of medical necessity, perhaps it's some E&M audits that are going on to that respect.
Yeah, it's actually the target and probe is sometimes also called for, very high volume, high cost procedures.
Mhm.
So,
Right, right. They're going because they're maximizing, the
yes.
revenue, and
Yes.
how much revenue they want to recoup. So, looking at that, could you explain what practices should keep in mind when responding to say, a TPE audit in comparison to, say, a CBR, which is that comparative billing report audit? Can you differentiate between those two? You touched on all of them, but I'm going to pick on those two for a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So really, most providers will never need a TPE, but within the TPE, many common errors are simple and easily corrected, such as a missing physician's signature,
Mhm.
or missing or incomplete initial certification or recertification. However, other errors include that are more in depth would be encounter notes that did not support all elements of eligibility, or documentation that does not meet medical necessity. The TPE is intended to increase accuracy in very specific areas. And Max used this data analysis to identify providers and suppliers who have high claim error rates or unusual billing practices, and items and services that have high national error rates and are a financial risk to Medicare. So within the TPE process, if you were chosen for the program, you will receive a letter from your MAC. The MAC will review 20 to 40 of your claims with supporting medical records. If you're compliant, great. You will not be reviewed again for at least 1 year on this selected topic. But it's important to note that there are other topics that you might be selected for, but on that particular topic, you would be fine for at least a year. If some claims are denied, then you would be invited to a one-on-one education session. At that time, you'll be given at least a 45-day period to make changes and improve. So what happens if you don't improve? Which, I can't imagine too many providers not improving or taking that seriously. But CMS does address this and says any problems that fail to improve after 3 rounds of education sessions will be referred to CMS for the next steps. These may include 100% prepay review, extrapolation, referral to a recovery auditor, or another action. And I think that when I look at those, the 100% prepay review would just be a nightmare for physicians.
Mhm.
It would just plug up any revenue. It would just bog it down, and then they would have to wait for all of those claims to be reviewed before any payments were made, which is not what any provider out there wants if they need to sustain their practice, paying their bills, paying their staff. So
Mhm.
that's why it's so important to take those one-on-one education sessions seriously, and to implement actions that will improve documentation, coding, improve reporting.
Mhm.
So, after a medical audit, it's important to take the corrective action steps to address any identified issues within that audit and to prevent future occurrences. And I have some key steps that you can take. Root cause analysis, investigate and identify the underlying causes of the issues found during an audit. A CAP or a CAP, a corrective action plan. Develop a detailed plan that outlines the steps needed to correct the identified issues. This plan should also include specific actions, responsible parties, and the deadlines associated. Team assembly, which we already touched on, but assemble a team or designated individual to oversee implementation of corrective actions. Ensure they have the necessary qualifications and authority. Training and education. This is a big one, provide training to staff on new procedures, policies, or best practices to prevent future issues. This might even include training, techs, training, medical coders on what they really need to look for within documentation. Don't rely on, you don't take the easy way out, get back to that old school coding where you're ensuring that the documentation truly supports every medical code that you're submitting. Policy and procedure updates, revise and update any relevant policies and procedures to address the audit findings and ensure compliance. We all know how important compliance is, and it's not an option. It's a requirement. It's not you get to choose if you want to do it or not. You must remain compliant. And then monitoring and follow up. Continuously monitor the implementation of the corrective actions and conduct follow-up audits to ensure the issues have been resolved. This is a very important step. And then, of course, documentation. Keep thorough documentation of all corrective actions taken, including the root cause analysis, the CAP, and any training or policy updates.
Wow, that's a lot. But it's also a lot of what you just stated is
Yeah,
stuff that your practices should be doing anyway,
right.
um, from a proactive standpoint.
Yes.
And you mentioned compliance. Everyone should have a compliance program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm amazed at how many practices still either have a compliance program that's some template they've had, and that's one of the first things they're going to do too is look at that compliance program. And if you're not adhering to it, you're probably worse off than if you didn't have one at all. Uh,
Yeah.
because now
It's
you're
meant to
not
protect
following your
you.
own procedures, right?
Yeah.
And in lieu of that, you could be put under a integrity program with like particularly Medicare, but they'll put you under
Mm.
an integrity program. And what that means is now you're under their compliance program. And because in lieu of one that you didn't have, or you just weren't following the one that you had in place, because it was a checkbox on somebody's list. We got to have a compliance
Right,
program. You know,
right.
so everything you mentioned is really something that, being proactive and having that in place, can make a big difference. Um,
It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of necessary work to protect
right,
your, to protect the practice, protect your provider, and protect your revenue.
right, exactly. So, and now, kind of shifting to, those post-payment reviews, um, and also the CBRs that you just alluded to, they often feel more critical due to that risk of recoupment. Even some of those worst case scenarios, three strikes and you're out. Uh,
Yeah.
so what are some of the best practices, if you like that cliche, for responding to a post reimbursement review audit and handling data discrepancies identified in a CBR?
Right. Well, I think that we know first and foremost, maintaining accurate and thorough documentation throughout the claim life cycle is essential for responding confidently to post-payment audits. So some things that you can do from that perspective is comprehensive patient records. Ensure that all patient interactions, treatments, and services are thoroughly documented. This includes notes on diagnoses, procedures, and any patient communications. Accurate billing and coding. Use the correct medical codes for all services provided. Accurate coding helps prevent errors and ensures that claims are processed smoothly. Timely documentation. That's a big one. Timely. Um, Document all services and interactions as soon as possible. Timely documentation reduces the risk of forgetting details and ensures that records are up to date. Consistent documentation practices. You want to establish a flow of consistent documentation practices across your practice. So this would include using standardized forms and templates to ensure uniformity. I mean, that's one thing that you could do. Regular training, again, providing ongoing training for staff on proper documentation practices and updates to coding guidelines. The guidelines update not all the time, but often. And so we need to keep our providers up to date on that. This helps maintain high standards and reduces the risk of errors. You want to perform internal audits, and conducting those internal audits to review documentation and identify areas for improvement before they become a problem during external audits. Compliance with regulations. So this includes HIPAA for patient privacy and other industry specific standards. You want to ensure that your documentation practices comply with those relevant regulations and guidelines. And so by following these practices, you maintain accurate and thorough documentation where you're making it easier to respond confidently to those post-payment audits and ensuring compliance with all necessary guidelines.
Yeah, awesome. So very, very important steps there to make sure that you just keep your revenue safe. You want to keep it,
Yeah.
you don't want to have to pay anything back. And then I'm going to kind of combine two questions. These could be
Oh,
two separate questions, but I'm just going to kind of combine them. But because you're going to, talking about how a practice can take proactive measures, towards getting ready for a RAC audit. So it's almost like you got to have this mentality of preparing for a RAC audit even before you receive a letter. Because when it comes, and you mentioned documentation, documentation is likely going to be, the one thing you can do that saves the day.
yes.
As probably as part of that measure. I've always said documentation is king. If it's not documented, it didn't happen, but that's your proof, that's your evidence, so to speak, that this procedure was performed. There's medical necessity. So really, just kind of focus on, again, the mindset of I haven't even received an audit letter, but what do I need to do to prepare for an audit for when it happens?
So to prepare for it, again, some of these might overlap, but again, it's important for practices to perform those regular internal audits. Conducting those internal audits help identify and correct potential billing and coding issues before they are flagged by a RAC. You want to ensure that services are reported and coded appropriately, supported by medical records, and meet criteria listed in the LCD, NCD, or CPB, which is the Clinical Policy Bulletin for commercial payers. Self-audit findings should be communicated with practice manager, administrator, physicians, NPs, APPs, coding and billing teams. You want to review and correct those billing issues. You look for patterns in coding and billing errors, and then implement those corrective actions to eliminate those ongoing mistakes. And again, ensuring the proper documentation, training your staff appropriately with the compliance protocols and documentation requirements, and then continuously monitor billing procedures and ensure they comply with Medicare and Medicaid billing requirements. And just one other point I want to quickly make. So if you receive a letter and you're wondering about what needs to be submitted, what type of records, you want to make sure that you're submitting all corresponding complete medical records that are relevant to the requested topic. As a quick example, if you receive an audit request to review medical necessity for carotid ultrasound, like CPT 93880, you should send records that support the history of occlusion and stenosis of carotid arteries or any other reported ICD-10 code listed in the LCD. This may include past and recent EM notes, prior ultrasounds, carotid angiography, or a history of carotid endarterectomy. You should not send notes for echoes, TEEs, lower extremity ultrasounds, or heart catheterizations. Your goal is to validate and substantiate the order and performance of the diagnostic study with complete and thorough documentation using either current or historical records or a combination of both.
Nice, nice. Yeah, and you brought up a good point, supply the records that only pertain to the scope of the audit. Many
Yes.
times you may pass the audit, but they may look and find something else. It's always like
I didn't
whenever
even think about that. That's a great
yeah,
point.
yeah. I mean, it's almost like you're in trouble for something that you didn't even get the letter for. So
Right.
it's like you
Right.
just want to stay focused on just what they're asking for and don't volunteer anything else.
But if you're
Right,
applying, if you're applying all the things we talked about, then you should be fine anyway.
right,
So let's
exactly. Right, right. Well, with that, I think that's going to conclude, well, I know it's going to conclude our session today, but we do want to allow for a few Q&A questions. So just want to remind everyone to please submit your questions into the portal. I'm actually looking now to try and see if there's any there. We do have one here, Julie, and I don't know if we mentioned this or not. So yeah, it's a good question. So what are the common mistakes practices make where they respond to audit letters? And how can they
Oh,
avoid them? So yeah, so it's like,
um,
what from your experience, what mistakes have you seen?
probably not submitting enough records. Like I'll go back to the carotid example. The LCD is very, explicit in what supports medical necessity. And so if you're just going to send the records for the most recent carotid ultrasound that shows, yes, the patient had some stenosis, or no, they didn't, but maybe they had a carotid endarterectomy in the past, or maybe they had stenosis in the past that hasn't moved forward with other documentation, it wouldn't support that existing ultrasound. So that's why it's so important to know what records are to send. Not knowing exactly what records to send, not understanding the process of how important it is to respond in a timely manner, or what to do if you can't meet that deadline. That knowing that you can reach out and request additional time. And then not having a compliance plan that protects you, not in performing internal audits that are protecting you and the provider and your revenue as well. Those are some that I could think of off the top of my head.
Right, right. It's almost like you need to have a fire drill, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have, you need to have regular fire drills to know what everybody needs to do, what their responsibilities are, or even disaster recovery. There's always these systems that you got to put in place, and you have to practice them to make sure that then you go back and correct, what was found wrong. So when the real thing happens, it's automatic. Everybody has this muscle memory. So you just kind of have this memory of, yeah, this is exactly what we need to do. So it's just very, very important.
I'm
Uh,
actually going to save that question and do more in depth on that. I think that would be another great thing to talk about in maybe our
yeah,
next round. So thank you so much
sure.
for that awesome question.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I don't see any other questions. So we'll wrap things up. Julie, as always, you did great, and I appreciate you being on with us
Thank
today.
you. Yes, sir.
And just want to encourage everyone to stay tuned for another session on this. Again, this is a series. So we'll probably likely cover in our next session will be, okay, now what's next? What actions do we need to take? Actually putting to action what we talked about today when you receive the audit letter itself. So we're going to be speaking on many other topics in the coming weeks. So be on the lookout for next week's session and be sure to sign up with us. And we hope to see you then. So thanks, everyone.